Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's Cybersecurity Insider Program webinar. Today's topic is a healthcare cybersecurity attack dissection, a mini tabletop. We'll be going through some scenarios in a tabletop fashion. We have allocated an hour and a half for this session given the topic, but we expect it to go just a little bit more than an hour depending on questions. I'm Laura Pursley, Marketing Director with CloudWave. And joining us today is Jonathan Weiss, Senior Security Architect, and Clay Sides, Senior Principal Architect. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jonathan to get us started.
Thank you, Laura, and I want to thank everybody for taking time out of your schedule to join us today. We're going to be talking about the current threat landscape in healthcare. We're going to talk about ransomware attacks, some tools, tactics, and procedures. As Laura mentioned, we're going to do a mini tabletop scenario. And then we're going to talk about the path forward, what you can do to protect yourselves. And then any key takeaways from the tabletop and what we see currently in healthcare. Now, there are going to be some areas of our presentation today that is going to get into some technical aspects. If you have any questions, you can use the questions pane inside of GoTo, and Laura will let me know those. This can be very interactive, so anytime you have a question, please post it and we'll go ahead and address that. First, we want to start by taking a look at our scenario. I want to give you some time to think about our scenario today before we get into it. So the first part of the scenario is the SOC reports indicators of anomalous activity on the firewall's external interface. And upon learning that, the clinical team actually since they're more aware, they start looking and they determine the interface server, which is running in VMware, is having issues. There's data integrity issues that have been seen. And this server is crucial for patient data exchange. The VMware administrator, upon learning that there's been some activity going on, notifies the CIO of a known vulnerability on the VMware host. During the last patch window, he was able to patch all of the other VMware hosts, but the host that is housing the interface server wasn't able to be patched. So think about that as we go through. We're going to have some questions and answers as we get into our scenario, and hopefully it'll be good and interactive. As we talk about the current cyber threat landscape in healthcare, we're going to talk about a brief overview of some of the trends we're seeing in healthcare. Now, most of us know about ransomware attacks and supply chain attacks, so we're going to talk about some statistics or some things we're seeing. We're not going to dig into each one of these attack vectors, but we are going to talk about what is recent. First, we're going to start by taking a look at cybersecurity attack trends. And this is a percentage of growth that we're seeing in healthcare. And at the top of this, you can see supply chain attacks. And what's interesting is supply chain attacks have increased from 30% to 60%. So if we go, that is from 2023 to 2024. If we go back to 2022, this trend continues over the span of 2 years. Just below that, we see ransomware. Ransomware has gone from about 25% to about 55%. Below that is IoT. Below that, we have AI-driven attacks, and then cloud security vulnerabilities. As we move more to hybrid environments, those cloud security vulnerabilities are being exposed and exploited. And then at the bottom is deepfake attacks. What I found interesting about this is AI and deepfake are not at the top of the list. Supply chain attacks are. So when we look at ransomware attacks, according to a survey that was completed in 2024, 67% of healthcare organizations have been breached by some ransomware. That number is staggering. This doesn't include the repeat visits that we're seeing, and we are seeing some repeat incidents out in the market. Adversaries are targeting critical systems, but not only the critical systems, the clinical systems as well. So when we get into dissecting an attack, we're going to talk about a group that's actually attacking clinical systems. When we talked about the critical systems, of the critical systems, 66% of healthcare organizations, their backups were affected with ransomware. So that number is also large. It's not something that we didn't know. We knew to protect your backups. We know that you got to have immutable backups and offline backups, but the number of attacks that have affected backups is quite interesting. We talked about supply chain attacks and that being the number one as far as growth. And trusted vendors are increasingly the target of attacks to get into healthcare networks. And the significant increase in supply chain attacks in 2024 we looked at, we were at 30% in 2023, and we showed that we are at 60% now. But 2022 to 2023 was 100% increase, and we also saw 100% increase from 2023 to 2024. Now, Clay and I, we do a lot of risk assessments. We do a lot of maturity modeling, which we call our C2M2. And this is an area we see for a lot of opportunity in dealing with these supply chain and evaluating the security of your vendors. So if that is something we would encourage you to take a look at, make sure you're focusing on your supply chain. Phishing attacks. Phishing attacks aren't anything new, but what we are seeing is attacks are targeting administration and medical staff. And they're using AI, they're using that deep fake to either create audio messages or things that are a lot more believable to try to get someone to click on the email. They're tailoring them to healthcare professionals, so it's not so easy to spot them anymore where there's possibly bad grammar or it's obvious. Now with AI generation, it's becoming a lot more difficult to do that. There was actually an email spoofing attack on a medical software vendor, and it led to a breach of a health clinic in the Midwest in 2024. It disrupted patient vaccine schedules. So this is just one way that this can happen, and we look at the supply chain attack and how it can impact someone. There was also an attack that happened overseas in London, and a third-party reference lab was hit. And it really had a major impact on all of the hospitals who relied on that reference lab because of the reference lab being attacked. So there's different ways you can look at the supply chain risk. It could be that it's a attack vector into your environment, but it also could be that it impacts a service that you are reliant upon. OT and IoT. Now, a lot of times in IT, we think about the technology side of the house. We don't always think about the clinical side of the house. And when you look at OT and IoT, a lot of times that falls outside of IT scope. But what we're seeing is with a lot of these devices designed without strong security features, they become easy targets, especially medical devices. And we're starting to see attacks on those medical devices. We've been preparing for it for quite some time, but now we're seeing active attacks against those medical devices in order to disrupt patient care. Cyber criminals have exploited vulnerabilities in these medical devices, and we're going to take a look at that as we jump into our dissection of an attack. Risk from insider threats. Now, there's really two types of insider threats. There can be malicious insiders, and this is really the intentional, and then the accidental exposure, which is the unintentional. We don't always think about malicious insiders and insider threats, but we have to think about that employee that is in financial troubles and possibly gets contacted by a nation state who offers them a significant amount of money to send data. And we're seeing these attacks inside of healthcare. Also, there's the accidental exposure. Someone sending an email unintentionally, a PDF email that your scanners cannot scan because it's no longer image data. It's no longer text data, it's image data. It's difficult for those to be picked up on. So in your email filters, if you're not able to scan PDF images, you may be allowing some data to go out. So there's the unintentional insider threats that you may experience. Data integrity attacks. We're seeing attacks that are actually going after medical records, affecting the integrity of the data, which can lead to a misdiagnosis or improper treatment. And if the records are altered, it can be very difficult to recover the records. You can't even detect it in most cases. How do you know that something was altered? And if you can detect it, how do you recover from that?
And
Most
Jonathan,
likely, yes.
this is Clay. So one of the things I wanted to let people know is some of these things do sound a little abstract, but if you actually get into the news media, you'll find examples of these that have occurred. So for example, in this one particular instance that Jonathan's talking about, there actually was an attack on a clinic out in the Midwest that actually altered patients' vaccine records, and that led to incorrect dosages being administered. So this is a real issue that's starting to become prevalent in our industry.
Thank you, Clay. Risks posed by these threats, they really extend beyond data breaches, and they can affect patient care. And if you've attended any of our incident response seminars, you'll know that our primary focus is on patient care, because these attacks can disrupt life-saving care, they can alter medical treatments, and they can even lead to serious harm. And we see that in some of the events or incidents that we've talked about so far. And as part of our incident response, we really see 4 pillars for the incident response. And the top of that pillar, the first pillar, is actually the patients. So within the first 72 minutes, that's really where our key focus and priority needs to be, is on the patients. Past that 72 minutes up to the 8 hours, that's really where we want to focus on our staff. Where are they emotionally? What are their fears? What are their uncertainties? Are we addressing those? Are we communicating with our staff? Do they know what's going on? Next is our family. From that 8 hours to the next 24 hours, we want to focus on the family of the patient. Are we communicating with them? Do they know what to expect? Do they have any concerns that aren't being addressed? And then after all of those are addressed, that's when we want to look at our systems and our long-term goals and our objective of getting systems back online, back restored. This really becomes a patient-centric incident response, where we prioritize the patients, we evaluate the staff needs, we address the family concerns, we talk about what we know versus what we don't know, and this is a critical piece of the incident response. Then we talk about our status, our system statuses, and our objectives. But this doesn't end there. We got to continue thinking about prioritizing the patients. As things come back online, what systems do we bring online first? Are we continuing to evaluate and communicate with our staff and stay on top of where they are emotionally? Are we continuing to update and address the family? Are we continuing to evaluate what we know versus what we don't know, what we should know? So as we look at the disruption of clinical systems and the impact to patient safety, ransomware attacks, we've seen these in the past. We know they disrupt vital systems like EHRs. That's going to lead to delays in treatments, diagnostic procedures. Compromised medical devices, they have a direct impact on patient care, whether the system goes offline in the middle of a procedure or whether the data integrity has been tampered with. And if it has been tampered with, it can lead to incorrect treatments or misdiagnosis, which could be life-threatening. So that was the first pillar. We talked about patient safety. This is where we need to be focused and thinking about first. We need to be thinking about the clinical systems. We need to break free from thinking about the technology systems and how they work, and leaving the OT systems. Medical devices can be considered OT devices outside of IT. And that's why we really believe and emphasize the need for a patient-centric incident response plan. So that is pillar 1. And then as we talk about pillar 2, and we look at these, the current threats in healthcare, these threats can lead to increased workload, stress and burnout, because the EHR not being available, it's going to lead to stress. Communication breakdowns. Are the tools that you were using for communication, are they available? Were you relying on VoIP systems that are no longer there? Delay in patient treatment. Reliance on memory and incomplete data causes treatment delays. If you don't have previous history when you're looking at radiology or any other diagnosis, it's going to impact treatment. So some of the strategies that you can use, the good news is none of this is really new, but there are some things we need to think about and put some priority on. And we need to focus on these defense strategies. And the first is, in our opinion, going to be that incident response, doing clinical tabletops, making sure you're thinking about that patient-centric incident response. Traditionally, incident response in IT was protecting the data, and we need to think more about protecting the patient. Next is patching and vulnerability management. Are you updating systems? Are you addressing the vulnerabilities to keep the lateral movement from happening if something were to get into your environment? Segmenting networks for critical systems. Do you have your medical devices on the same network or VLAN as the rest of your environment? What protections do you have in place? Now, it may be impossible for you to highly segment your network. You may have to focus on critical areas like your pumps, and you may have to put them into their own VLAN and have that VLAN default gateway be on your firewall that has next-gen capabilities. Whereas if you're back to your core, all you've got is maybe some layer 2 filtering. So think about how you're segmenting and a multi-phase approach for a crawl, walk, run approach to implement in segmentation. Backup and recovery plans. We talked about the impact and 66% of backups being impacted. Not only are you backing up and having offline backups or immutable backups, but have you tested those backups? When's the last time you actually spun them up to make sure they're working? Are you bringing back enough systems to where you know that it's going to work across the infrastructure? And then zero trust architecture. Zero trust is really a buzzword. And in healthcare, we are still using a lot of technology, still rolling out a lot of technologies that really are in conflict with zero trust. And those technologies are things like single sign-on, where we badge into the system and we have access to everything once we get into the environment, or geofencing. If you're at the hospital, we trust that you're there. Now, hopefully you've segmented away your guest network from your internal network. That way somebody on your guest network isn't geofenced. But when we look at zero trust, that's really saying that we don't trust you even though you're at the facility. Even though you're logged in, we don't trust. If you're going to this critical asset, we're going to make you MFA again, right? We're going to prohibit you from getting to file shares unless you show us or authenticate again. So focusing on zero trusting, moving away from some of those comfortable technologies that we use that make life easier. And it's not an easy thing to do. It is a difficult transition to make. Next, we're going to talk about and dissect a recent attack on US healthcare systems. This is an actual attack. And we're going to look at the tools, tactics, and procedures that were used for this attack. Now, as Clay mentioned, a lot of these attacks we've mentioned so far, they're real. And we're going to talk about today the Vanilla Tempest group. And if you haven't read anything about the Vanilla Tempest group, this is the group that's been named by Microsoft and tracked by Microsoft. That's the name Microsoft gave them. But we can give you the links to the articles to read about everything we're going to talk about here. We're going to talk about the tools that they use. And we're going to talk about the impact that one of their attacks has had on a healthcare organization. Something that's very interesting and scary about the Vanilla Tempest group is they are focused on healthcare. Not only are they focused on healthcare, but part of their goal is to disrupt patient care. They're no longer looking to get your data and hold it for ransom. They're looking for ways that they can impact your patients and get you to pay a ransom so they don't do that. They were actually created or first noticed in 2021. And like I say, they're targeting healthcare. It's one of the three areas that they target. And again, they are focused on impacting patient care. Some of the tools they use, ransomware, they've been known to use very different or a handful of different ransomwares. Ricetta is one, and most notably Ink ransomware, which is a ransomware as a service as far as we can tell. Their primary sectors besides healthcare are education and government, and their attack methods are double extortion. Now we'll talk a little more about double extortion, what that is, at another slide later on, but they use lateral movement via RDP and then they deploy ransomware across networks. So the actual tools they use are bootloader, malware downloader. For lateral movement, they're using Cobalt Strike, Mimikatz, AnyDesk, and Mega. Now we're going to talk about all of these as we go through the slides. And for ransomware deployment, they're using the built-in WMI feature of Windows. So bootloader. Bootloader is intended to create the initial access, and there's two ways that they're using bootloader. And the first way is doing search engine optimization poisoning. So it's SEO poisoning. If you look on the right, this is actually an image from a Google search, or a search engine rather, that if you look at the top, some of the first things that come back are search engine optimized ads. And what the attackers are doing, what Vanilla Tempest is doing, is they're exploiting websites, and they're using search engine optimization poisoning to move their sites, their attack sites, higher in the list. A lot of organizations do not block these ads at the top. It's not really an easy thing to do, but they don't block these ads. And one of the latest things that has been seen is they have crafted their bootloader is essentially when you search for a legal document, a free legal document, if you were to go out and search for a free legal document, you may run into a site that has bootloader on it. And what happens is the user downloads it and executes it. Then bootloader is going to download and execute more malware. So this can be used to siphon data from victims, get a foothold into the environment, and then deploy other tools like Cobalt Strike. So bootloader is the initial entry point. If we look at the bootloader attack chain, so at the top I said that they got this SEO site. Now I did not mention the other way that they're using bootloader is through social engineering. So bootloader, it either comes in through a search engine optimization poisoning, or it comes in through a zip archive in a socially engineered email. And the user downloads that zip file, which contains a JavaScript, and they execute that JavaScript. Now, when that JavaScript runs, it's going to use the built-in feature of WScript, and WScript is actually going to reach out to a couple of C2 domains and download 2 payloads. And what's very interesting about this attack is it doesn't use any files. It's a fileless attack. And it loads the file into different parts of registry. Now, what we're looking at here is a mandiant. This is a mandiant representation of the attack chain. We are going to look at the trend micro representation of the attack chain as well. But that fileless download that it does is loaded into the registry, and it's loaded into different points. And I found it very interesting. It actually loads it into 5 different points in registry. And what it's doing is it's breaking that code up and obfuscating it throughout the registry. There's actually 2 registry entries that it makes, or 2 different programs that it puts into the registry. And then it uses WScript to execute a PowerShell. And that PowerShell launches what's called phone launch. Phone launch is a tool that is used to run from registry. So there's no files placed on the computer. What's even more impressive about this attack is that they're using hex. And what they're doing is they're using hex and then replacing certain hex characters with binary. And when they replace those hex characters with binary, at that point, they can flip all of the hex into binary, and now they have an executable binary. That's the first thing that happens with phone launch. Now, the second thing that happens is the PowerShell actually creates a scheduled task, and it executes a script. And what that is doing is making it persistent. So it's entering those registry keys back in case you were to reboot. So all of this is running from memory out of registry. Now, when we look at the trend micro diagram, it's a little bit different. You can see the threat actor on the left. You can see the employed search engine poisoning at the top and the compromised legitimate website. And then we have our user at the top. So the user's out searching for, let me get a free legal document. And then they download a zip file that they think is a free legal document. They open it up, there's a JavaScript inside. They execute that JavaScript, which is going to do the first stage of the script, and it's going to go out and check for a marker in registry. And this is where Trend Micro and Mandiant differ a little bit, is that Trend Micro says that there's a registry key that Mandiant didn't. Now, there's been multiple variations of bootloader over time. Initially, it was a little more simplistic about how it entered into registry and the obfuscation it was making. And then in the later versions, they even moved to using the modulus operator in some algorithm to be able to move the text around to make it even more difficult for your malware detection to find. So that script's going to go out and it's going to look at a domain, and then it's going to connect to a URL where it gets that second stage script. The second stage script is going to create that scheduled task, and then it's going to run that PowerShell script at the bottom. The PowerShell script is going to go to the registry, which you see in the dotted line, and then it's going to execute out of the registry. What it's doing is it's pulling Cobalt Strike Beacon. Now we are going to talk about Cobalt Strike Beacon a little bit in the next slide, but Cobalt Strike Beacon is essentially how it's the command and control system that's being used. So Cobalt Strike goes out and it talks to the CNC server, and that allows the threat actor to get in. So that is the initial phase of the compromise, and we'll cover that again a little bit later. So as far as Cobalt Strike is actually a tool that was developed for cybersecurity testing, and it provides a comprehensive suite of tools that can be used for network pen testing. On the right in this image, you can see it's a command line tool here that's being used, and it allows the attackers, they're essentially exploiting the benefits that we get out of the pen testing tool and turning it into a command and control tool where they can maintain persistence into an environment or take over compromised systems inside of an environment. They can execute commands, move laterally, and do other things from inside using Cobalt Strike Beacon. A little bit about the infection process with Cobalt Strike. It uses encrypted channels. So when it talks back from the infected host back to the CNC servers, it's using encrypted channels to be stealthy. This is why it's important to have decryption if you can get decryption in your environment. Data exfiltration timeline, typically about 30 days for data exfiltration. Multiple stages involve data collection, downloading files, and accessing historical web data. It's a fileless malware delivery. We talked about how it's pulled from memory and how it's used to be fileless. Command distribution, it actually can pull commands out of URLs to control those infected systems. And as you can see here on the left-hand side, it has an IP address that it's communicating with as the command and control server. The next tool they use is Mimikatz. Mimikatz is a well-known, exploited tool that allows you to extract passwords out of memory, hash dumps, or even Kerberos tickets. And you can see in the left-hand image here, this is it in use, and it's got some passwords that it's displayed there. So hackers are using this to escalate privileges once they get in the environment by extracting credentials and impersonate higher privileged users, such as an administrator or someone within the network. This is another example of Mimikatz in use. We'll start at the bottom. You can see that Joe user is actually who's logged in. That's the first yellow section. And right above that, actually, let's go to the top. At the top, what's actually happening is Mimikatz is being used to take advantage of what's called a golden ticket. It's a Kerberos ticket where it can be used later on. And you can see that the Kerberos ticket is actually for a user called Darth Vader. So Joe user is using Darth Vader's Kerberos ticket to connect to a network share. As you look at the bottom of the image here, where it says net use, and it says it connected successfully, that is where Mimikatz has been used to take that Kerberos ticket and escalate privileges. AnyDesk. A lot of healthcare organizations and a lot of organizations, they allow or rely on RDP for remote management. Vanilla Sky is actually using RDP to move laterally. And they're using a product called AnyDesk. It is a legitimate tool, which makes it hard to track or hard to block. and they're using it once they get internal to move laterally in the environment. That allows them to maintain that persistence in the environment and to monitor the environment in real time or intervene when necessary. Another tool that's being used is Mega data synchronization. And Mega is a legitimate cloud storage platform. I've run into it in the past where you have things like marketing files or videos that someone wants to share with the organization, so they ask you to open up Mega. Well, Vanilla Tempest is taking advantage of these legitimate tools and using them to exfiltrate stolen data. That's why it's important in your firewalls to have application next-gen firewalls, but to also look at those online file storage areas to see what's allowed and what you allow and what you disallow based on your organization's risk tolerance. These things are less likely to be flagged by security systems, and they're a stealthy tool for data exfiltration. On the right here is an image. This is actually an image of Mega and what it looks like, but it's not uncommon to any other online storage tool. This is just the tool they use to exfiltrate data. So let's talk through the attack, the 4 stages of the attack that Tempest is using. They're using bootloader. They're using for that initial entry into the environment. Now, the case we're going to be looking at is an actual case, and they used a phishing email to gain that early entry. And then they exploited vulnerable web applications and credentials. They used Mimikatz to extract passwords and escalate privileges across the hospital. Then they used Cobalt Strike, that command and control feature, to give them that remote access in. To move laterally, we talked about they used AnyDesk to maintain that long-term control of the environment, and then they used Mega to be able to exfiltrate the stolen data. This is really the phase 3 of what we're seeing. And then there's a threat of, leak sensitive patient information records unless you pay that ransom. So when we talk about double extortion, we mentioned double extortion. So the first phase of extortion is they exfiltrate the data, and they try to get organizations to pay a ransom not to release that exfiltrated data. So that's the first step in that double extortion. The second step is deploy ransomware. And that's where they lock the systems, they encrypt the systems and make them unavailable. Used as leverage for a ransom demand. So that double extortion, like we say, they threaten to leak the extorted data on the dark web. Actually, the first stage was the ransomware. If you're able to recover from your backups, that's when they typically move from the first stage, which was the ransomware, to the second stage where they're threatening to leak that exfiltrated data. So the impact to healthcare, this is an actual incident that we've dissected here. And the threat to patient care is delays in procedures and appointments. In one case, it cost a hospital $63 million to recover from the downtime and the infrastructure rebuild in one of the attacks that they had this year. And not only do you have the monetary value, you're going to lose reputation. You're going to have reputational damage due to compromised patient trust and delayed services. And Clay, I'm not sure if you had anything to add. I thought I heard you.
Nope, I'll jump in as I need to, but yeah, the soft costs are something that are not to be dismissed, right? As we're all aware. With these double extortion type tactics, this is usually what they're preying on, right? The first one is to try and encrypt data, and once the data is encrypted, you have to pay the ransom to unlock it, essentially. And if you do, the next thing they'll hit you with is, as Jonathan said, it's that risk, right? That reputation risk. Do you really want your patients to know we've grabbed your data? So it's kind of a double hit, and that's really a large item, right? How many patients are not being seen because your reputation has been tarnished because of someone's malintent? Go ahead.
Now, I didn't run across any instances where Vanilla Tempest has reached out to patients and tried to get them to pay.
Right.
Did not run across that for Vanilla Tempest, but a $63 million event is quite astounding. So what can you do? What can healthcare organizations do to protect against this threat? Implement multi-layer phishing protection, which is email filters, advanced threat protection. That's your ability to scan those attachments for malware, your phishing simulations and training staff. And if they are not, if you have anyone that is actually clicking, doing some follow-up remedial training, make sure you have DMARC, DKIM, and SPF records. That keeps other organizations or outsiders from being able to use your email domain as they email. You want to make sure those are properly configured and enforced. Securing web applications and remote access. You want to make sure your perimeter is patched. When we talk about patching, make sure your perimeter's patched, your firewalls are patched, and all of the devices touching the internet are patched. Those should be priority. You also want to look at the applications themselves. Are you running on outdated versions of email or any other system that may be sitting out on the internet? Make sure you close down those vulnerabilities. Limit access to tools like AnyDesk, RDP, and VPNs. Seeing a trend of moving away from VPNs, both client-based VPN and web-based VPN, and moving more towards a remote access tool that allows tracking and recording vendor sessions or user sessions. RDP, can you create a GPO that locks down that only IT user accounts can use RDP? Can you restrict that in any way to lock that down some? Blocking tools like AnyDesk, blocking tools like Mega. Multi-factor authentication, making sure, especially on the external, that all of your systems support MFA. But are you using MFA internally? Are you using it on your network architecture? Are you using it to create that zero trust? Endpoint security, moving to an EDR or even a XDR, so endpoint detection and response and extended detection and response, and that allows the manufacturer of that solution to actually help you engage and mitigate those threats real time. Regular malware scanning. Are you scanning your devices? Are you scanning your systems? The systems that are going home, the laptops, are those being held to the same compliance? Are you scanning third-party vendor systems when they connect to your environment, or do you allow full IP once they connect in? How are you preventing them from spreading something once they connect to the environment, which would be something like a posture assessment when they connect? Data backup and recovery plans. Making sure you back up your critical systems, make sure you have those immutable copies, make sure you have those offline copies, and checking them. Do you have periods of backups that go back to give you some defense if your backups were to be compromised? Can you go back to a year? Can you go back to 2 years? What is your retention policy? And making sure that you at least have some copies that are not connected to your main network. Disaster recovery plans. Simulate ransomware attacks, ensure your backup and recovery process are effective and well practiced. We want to make sure this is not a check the box exercise. We want to make sure that we are really taking these disaster recovery plans and doing these tabletops to get the most out of them, to get those lessons learned that we can improve upon. Network segmentation, zero trust architecture. If we can't do a full network segmentation, a highly segmented network, can we at least split off critical systems? Now, we typically split off servers from our workstations, but are there devices on those workstation networks that shouldn't be there because of the security risks they pose? Do you have camera systems, or are your facility control systems on the same network? Do you have outdated radiology or lab equipment? Does it need to be on its own network? Does it need to have your firewall as the gateway so you can use some of those next-gen capabilities to evaluate what traffic and what attachments are flowing. Do you decrypt traffic internally in your network? Do you decrypt traffic going outbound in your network? And decryption, a brief on decryption is where you essentially play man in the middle, where you intercept traffic and your firewall or whatever device you're doing decryption with actually establishes the connection to the outside resource and establishes another connection to the inside asset. That allows it to decrypt all the traffic and see what's passing through it. Are you doing decryption? And when you think about decryption, you also have to think about what do you decrypt. There are some things you should not decrypt. Do you decrypt healthcare? Do you decrypt financial? Do you decrypt government sites? There needs to be some bypasses. Zero trust network, implement zero trust principles. And that's really, we talked about assuming that no one inside or outside of the organization is trusted by default. It's getting away from that single sign-on. I know that SAML and OpenID are still very, very popular. A lot of vendors are just rolling out SAML or just rolling out OpenID. And if they are doing that, are you at least using MFA so that you protect yourself to where if someone does get credentials, that they can't move laterally or escalate privileges inside of the environment? That's where that zero trust comes into play. Incident response preparedness. Now, incident response needs to be patient-centric, and you need to create an incident response plan that includes your clinical team. You want to outline the steps to follow in case of an attack, but you don't want to just look at it from a technology perspective. You want to look at it from a clinical perspective. How is this impacting our patients? And then you want to have regular tabletop exercises. It's good to have your IT tabletops, but it's also good to have a clinical tabletop. And that's where you engage all of the clinical staff that are able to participate as part of an exercise on how it would impact patient care. That's going to be a lot of your administrative team, your directors, to go through that tabletop exercise as it relates to patient care. Monitoring and auditing, using a SIEM, security information and event manager, to collect events from all of your different servers, applications, hardware, and are you collecting the right amount of events? Are you collecting the right amount of data? There are limitations, resource limitations to what you can collect and what you should collect. So you have to think through what systems are sending to your SIEM. And does that SIEM allow correlation? User behavior analytics. Can you determine that someone who normally works a 9 to 5 shift is logged in at 3 a.m.? That is an anomaly. Does your SIEM send to a SOC where you have 24/7 eyes on glass? Maybe even a team that's their primary role is looking at cyber events. Audit privileged accounts, regularly audit accounts with administrative privileges and remove unnecessary access. We really want to look at things like those domain admin accounts. In time, we have a lot of vendors that will come in and say, we need a domain admin for this software to run, and that a lot of times isn't the case. Or someone creates a domain admin account that really just needs to be a service account, an account that doesn't even have a password. Now, you can use Privileged Access Manager, what we call PAM, to help you with that, but you also need to be auditing those administrative privileges and contacting and seeing if you can reduce those privileges. Reduce that footprint that could be exploited. I want to pause here and ask if we've got any questions. So, Laura, have we seen any questions so far?
We don't have any questions at this time.
Thank you, Laura. From here, we're going to go into our tabletop scenario. Now, this is really a mini tabletop. There is going to be some interaction in it, and we're going to go back to the original phase 1. So in phase 1, the SOC has reported indicators of an anomalous activity on the firewall's external interface. The clinical team, with a heightened sense of awareness, has detected an issue on the interface server, which is housed in VMware. And this server is crucial for patient data exchange. So they're seeing that things aren't saving. They're seeing that Data coming out of the system seems to be erroneous. And then lastly, the VMware administrator has notified a CIO of a known vulnerability of that VMware host. And while other hosts have been patched, the patch window prevented installation on the last host. They simply ran out of time and updated all the other hosts. Now, as we get into the questions, I want to say this is on a fictitious hospital. I want you to look at this from your incident response and how you would answer. There's not always a correct answer. There are better answers than other answers, but when you see these questions, I don't want you to think, well, I want you to answer. I don't want you to think that there's a right answer and you may get it wrong and not answer it. The results are going to be anonymous, but also I want you to think about it and how your organization would respond. So at the top here, this is just talking through again what the phase 1 is. And that's that the SOC has detected anomalous activity on the external, that we've noticed the interface server has some data integrity issues, and the CIO is made aware of a vulnerability on the host. Laura, if you could you go ahead and launch the first question? All right, so based on your incident response plan, what would you do? Would you shut down the VMware host to prevent further exploitation? Would you disconnect the VMware host from the network to isolate it? Would you investigate further without disrupting the host to avoid interrupting critical services? Would you shut down the interface server virtual machine to prevent further data integrity issues? Or would you engage the clinical team and declare an incident? So if you would take a moment and go ahead and answer that.
There's still some responses coming in, Jonathan, so I'll leave it open for a little bit longer.
Yeah, please take your time. And if you have any questions, if you'll post them in the questions section, we'll answer those as well.
And by all means, try and respond as your organization would, like Jonathan said, rather than trying to figure out what we're expecting or what we would ask for if we were running this.
Okay, looks like the voting is slowing down. I'll leave it open for another moment for those last minute responses.
Just a reminder to folks, this is anonymized, so don't worry, there's no names being recorded. We're not going to go back later and hold this over anyone's heads. So
really, this exercise is to stimulate thought. How would you respond? What is the appropriate response? And each organization could have a different response based on the threat tolerance and business goals of that organization.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Oh, looks like still people are voting. Don't want to cut anyone off. Leave it open for 5 more seconds.
This is the fun part where we actually get people to engage. So it's nice to have some interactivity.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share the poll so you can see the results.
All right, so disconnect the VMware host from the network to isolate it. All right. So it looks like we've got a pretty good 50%, it looks like, said to disconnect it. So we're going to go with answer B. So the team opts to migrate all VMs from the host and disconnect the VMware host running the interface server. And that's really based on that assumed risk of the vulnerability. This disconnection actually affects not only the interface server, but other critical systems due to resource issues. This leads to slow login times, delayed access to patient records, and interruptions to patient care workflows. Now your clinical team comes to you and says, hey, we're having issues here. Some patients are not receiving timely treatments due to the system slowdowns, and this is creating patient safety risk. So if you'll go ahead, Laura, and launch the second question. All right, so due to an unknown vulnerability, the team's migrating all the VMs, disconnecting the VM host running the interface server, streams the remaining host. It's causing slow login times. Some of these login times are 2 to 3 minutes, delayed access to patient records, interruption in patient workflows. patient care workflows. And these slowdowns are impacting patient safety. Some patients aren't even getting their timely treatments. So what would you do at this point? Would you continue investigating the host for signs of compromise and malware? Work closely with the clinical team to understand what systems are most affected and prioritize restoring those first? Bring the incident response team to assess the situation and potential cyber attack? Reboot the host to restore those services quickly and reduce that resource contention issue? Notify leadership that this could be a ransomware event and initiate incident response procedures.
Okay, votes are still coming in, so we'll leave it open for a little bit longer. All right, looks like it's slowing down a little bit. We'll leave it open for a few more moments and then close it out. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll.
All right, so it looks like a majority have said to work closely with the clinical team. So answer B. Now we may differ a little bit here in our scenario, which is fine. So in phase 3, we're actually going to say after 2 days of investigation, the team lacking malware expertise and having to call a third party has found no malware or signs of compromise on the VMware host, but reloaded the system. So out of an abundance of safety, no malware was found, but they went ahead and reloaded the system. However, during that time, login slowness has continued and patient care is increasingly affected due to the delays in accessing critical systems. At 3 a.m., we get a new issue, and IT starts receiving a report of a complete login failure across the network. Upon further investigation, they actually find that the main domain controller, the primary one, what we call the FSMA role, has corrupted data. And the backup DC we find hasn't been synced for months. This is a problem because the most recent backup that we can find is 2 months old, which was predating a merger. So there's a lot of information that was created, new user accounts, new objects in Active Directory that are no longer there because the data has been corrupted in that primary domain controller and it had not been syncing. So as we go to the phase 3 question, Laura, could you go ahead and load, please? So after 2 days of investigation with third-party help, no malware has been found on the VMware host, but the login slowness is continuing, affecting patient care. And at 3 a.m., IT reports complete login failures. The system has been restored, the host system has been restored, and everything was checked out, everything looked good, but at 3 a.m. we started having login failures and then learned that the domain controller was corrupted and there were no backups. So at this point, what should we do? Should we rebuild Active Directory from scratch, knowing it's going to take several days, cause continued outages, we need to get this thing up quickly? Do we attempt to repair the corruption and sync the DCs? What might avoid a full AD rebuild, but it comes with a significant risk? Because if we go down that path, it may take longer and we may have to go ahead and rebuild anyway. Should we use the 2-month-old backup to restore AD, even though it predates critical updates from the merger? Should we communicate with hospital leadership, including the clinical team, to decide the best course of action that minimizes patient care impact? And should we work with marketing to develop a message for the community?
Okay, there's still some votes coming in. All right, we'll leave it open for another few moments. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll.
All right, it looks like we have a majority that have said determine the course of action with the C-suite and the clinical team. And I really like to see that. We're thinking about the impact on patient care, and that's what we really like to see. Now, our hospital, they actually went a different route. The IT team actually jumped in and started working with leadership to address the long-term impact of rebuilding Active Directory. And after several days of disrupted care, AD is finally rebuilt. So even if we talk to clinical teams at this point, we're still going to have that issue with the disruption to patient care. And we had disruptions in patient scheduling, treatments that led to widespread frustration across the clinical team. Once everything was rebuilt, they did a deeper dive to look at what was going on. And it was actually revealed that the underlying issue was due to a failing motherboard in the VMware host. The decision to shut down the server, the host, actually caused more issues. The fact that they assumed that there was a cyber event, shut the system down, actually led to more failures and the eventual corruption of Active Directory. So the situation got worse, essentially due to assuming that it was a cyber event. The clinical team was not consulted early enough, and it impacted patient care, worsening the impact than it overall would have. So they took a technology approach to respond. They only had a technology-based incident response plan. It did not include clinical care, and they went immediately to let's take the system offline. Some key takeaways. Patient care is always at risk. The technical reaction in phase 1 led to unnecessary system responses and delayed care. IT and the clinical disconnect. The fact that the IT team responded without involving clinical led to recovery decisions that didn't prioritize critical systems. What they could have done is involved clinical systems and determine once the resource contention happened, what systems are critical and what aren't. Now, had they had a patient-centric incident response plan, they would have already identified what the clinical systems were and already have those marked as priority. And then those lower marked priority systems could have been shut down to use those resources for those critical systems. There was a bit of cyber event hypersensitivity. There was a failure to accurately diagnose the hardware issue. When we talked about, if we go back and we look at the first phase, we talked about anomalous events on the outside interface of the firewall. We see hits on the outside interface of the firewall all the time. We probably see anomalous hits on the firewall. Just because we had it go to the SOC does not mean we react to that. And that's what happened in this scenario. So it led to an escalation that could have been avoided. The simulation, this was really built and designed to create or provoke thought. And it shows how even the technical issue that has nothing to do with clinical can quickly escalate and negatively impact patient care. And that's when the incident response plan doesn't focus on patient care. That's why we've got to incorporate, we've got to involve our clinical teams, and we got to take incident response from being a IT technology-based response to an organization enterprise-wide response. We're going to talk about some scenario opportunities, which include initial detection and incident triage. We're going to talk about real-time communication with clinical teams, and we're going to talk about containment strategy, prioritizing patient data. We're going to have alternative workflow activation discussion, critical system restoration first, and then post-incident review with clinical team output. Now, these are all opportunities. These are takeaways. These are things that from doing this tabletop, we should look at lessons learned. So now I'm going to hand it over to Clay. Clay is going to go through the lessons learned from this tabletop scenario.
Thank you very much. We're also going to give Jonathan a chance to catch his breath. The poor guy's been talking the whole time. So we can go ahead and jump into the next slide. Let's go ahead and talk about how this should have been addressed moving forward. Ideally, we always want to remember, why are we here? We are here to focus on patients and patient care. So always remember, the first thing to do is focus on the patient. Heroes say that a lot. So the objective here is really to focus on prioritizing those patient-facing systems. So if you've assessed the systems you already have that are critical to providing that care, you can understand which systems should be best protected or left operational in the event of, like in this case, a resource constraint. All right, we took down a single host, the entire environment became stressed because there were insufficient resources to accommodate the remaining workload. If you've prioritized those clinical care systems that have to remain online to do your primary job, which is focus on the patient, then you could look at potentially taking steps to shut down some of those systems that are not required for that particular function. Maybe they are important, but they're not as important, for example, in this particular instance. We jump to the next slide, please. Best thing you can do is communicate with the clinical teams. This has to be a real-time dialogue. We have to make sure that that communication is happening clearly. One of the things that we always want to do is understand what the clinical side of the house is seeing versus what we're seeing. In this particular case, if we start to get reports that, as IT people, that there are delays occurring in the patient systems, we can immediately send out comms to notify supervisors that maybe they need to start taking alternative actions. Maybe they need to prepare for working on paper records or be prepared for activating procedures that allow them to work on slower data access. So try and really have open communication with the folks that are accomplishing your primary objective, which is caring for those patients. Next one, please. Develop a containment strategy now. Everyone talks about we've got a containment strategy. Well, we're working on it. We have some ideas. It doesn't matter right now. Don't let perfect become the enemy of good. So if you can develop a plan to isolate those non-critical systems so that you can help potentially spread the lateral movement while preserving those patient care systems, like Jonathan had discussed. Network segmentation is huge. Even if it's not perfect, again, it's a good. Anything that slows down people from getting around your network to help prevent the spread of issues across your systems will be a plus. So in this, yep, thank you. Nope, you're right. Alternative workflow actions, take a different path. If for some reason you have an outage that is causing a major disruption, maybe you need to activate a contingency plan here for maintaining care during that particular outage. Maybe it's a slowdown. Instead of actually discussing it as a slowdown, maybe you go to those offline procedures, if you will, right away. So in order to ensure that other systems don't get affected here, again, we employ network segmentation to separate things like the medical devices, the pharmacy systems, the printers, the IoT devices. So we want to preserve the patient care systems. Even if you're in a paper-based mode at the moment, you need to be able to continue to provide updates where you can to your staff, your clinical team, so that they have as much information as you can get them while you identify where the issues are and resolve what the systems have been impacted. You need to really prioritize going back in time. One of the first things we always want to do as IT people is, well, we just want to jump to the first backup and go ahead and restore that. Restoring systems can be very time consuming, and it doesn't necessarily resolve all of the issues immediately. So in this particular case, after the ransomware attack was contained, if you prioritize the restoration of the EHR systems that are necessary, basically to allow people to continue to care for your patients if they need to be, then you can again focus on trying to provide more care so we don't have to fire up the Back to the Future cars we've seen here and try and go at it again. You could jump to the next slide. And just in case you have any Back to the Future junkies like myself, fun little Easter egg, if you have an O'Reilly Auto Parts near you, you can actually look up part number 121G on their website. And this is actually a screenshot from that. They do, apparently, they're out of stock temporarily on the flux capacitors necessary to fire up those DeLoreans. If we could jump to the next one. Get input. As the post-incident review is conducted, you need to really focus on assessing the post-incident impacts to the patient care and make adjustments in your strategies. One of the things that we always try and do is a lessons learned. That's really what we're talking about here, but don't let that lessons learned fail to contact or take into account the clinical teams. Because again, the clinical teams can probably come back and tell you the things that worked well for them and the things that didn't work well for them. And maybe it'll surprise you in some instances on the resourcefulness for your clinical staff and the things they do to go after our primary mission, which is again, to affect patient care. Lastly, we're going to bring this slide up again because we feel it's extremely important to focus on this particular set of pillars. Always, always, always focus first on the patients. This is what we do. This is why we're here, is to take care of the patients. How we do that is by utilizing staff that are properly trained. We need to also ensure the staff feels comfortable and confident. They're informed. We're addressing any fears or any concerns that they may have about the incident or about how they're going to communicate or how they're going to care for their patients. Once we've taken care of that, we absolutely have to talk to the families. Word will start to get out that there's communications issues or there appears to be something going on. The messaging that we send to the families can be sometimes very difficult to traverse or to travel down that path, but it is very, very important to try and allay their concerns and make them understand that their loved ones are being well cared for and well tended to. Lastly, once we get through the first three items, then we want to try and identify what changes need to be made in our systems, what fixes need to be employed, what repairs need to be effected to get this thing back online. If we don't have the patients, if we don't have the staff and the family is not comfortable, then the systems are irrelevant. We won't need them. So essentially, that's going to be the end of our business. And that's not what anyone wants to do. Just kind of in summary, what we've kind of talked about today is the cyber threat landscape that we're all faced with in healthcare. It's always changing, it's always evolving. We're always trying to find new ways to try and get at our environments. As you saw, supply chain attacks are one of the easy ways in. So sites and people are trying to take advantage of that. We've dissected the anatomy of a breach and tried to develop some lessons learned, things we can look at. Trying to look at some of the tools that these hackers are using really is astounding. I'm in this industry, I'm in this particular discipline, and I find this unfortunately fascinating because of the ingenuity these people have undergone. And it's only going to accelerate. With the advent of AI, we're going to start to see these things start to ramp up much more rapidly. Believe it or not, if anyone here has ever used ChatGPT or any of their equivalents, the bad guys have their own. There is WormGPT, which is actually available to help try and craft verbiage for phishing attempts. There is WolfGPT, which actually helps coders develop bad code or malintended code to get around the policies that ChatGPT and Microsoft have both employed. We've run through a tabletop scenario to kind of highlight some of the things that we have a tendency to do in IT, which is focus on preservation of the systems. That's what we're charged with. But what we have to remember is Why are we charged with preserving these systems? It's all for the benefit of the patients. And lastly, dealing with today's cyber threats. Try and identify things that you can do proactively to be prepared. Remember, Jonathan had indicated 67% of facilities have experienced some sort of cyber incursion or attack. If you haven't been attacked, someone else on this call may have been attacked twice. So take that into consideration and try and identify anything you can take away from this that could help make your position different on how to deal with these threats. And again, remember, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Anything you can do to shore up your environment and continue to try and progress that moving forward is ideally what we're after. Laura, do you want to go ahead and talk through our next tip?
Yes, thank you, Clay and Jonathan, for the information today. If anyone does have a question, please enter it in the questions pane and we'll address that before the end of the webinar. Just wanted to give you a reminder that next month's webinar is October 31st at 2 o'clock. The topic is a conversation with a former hacker. It's with Hector Monsegur, who has joined us previously. It's usually one of our highest attended webinars. It's very interesting to hear his perspective from a hacker turned good. Hector actually does our pen testing. And so we're going to also share some of our key learnings from pen tests that we've done over the last few years and what you should be or could be considering going forward. So that'll be a great one, October 31st. You are already registered for that. You should get the reminders in your email. And then October is also Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So we'll be sending out a lot of information in October for you to educate your teams, and we encourage you to put a little extra focus on cybersecurity next month and use this information, like Clay said, just anything that you can do to put extra focus, extra training for your teams. We'll be sharing a lot of that information. So look for that in the news email that will come out on October 1st. And I don't see any questions. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Jonathan and Clay, for the information. And there will be a survey at the end when you close out the webinar if you want to take that and let us know how we did. And we'll see you on the webinar next month. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.